They're asking where the immediate family should sit. The funeral director leaned toward me so quietly that no one else seemed to notice him. His black notebook rested against his chest. His voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent years speaking inside rooms where every sentence had to be measured. "I don't want to make assumptions, Mrs. Carter," he said. "Could you tell me which family members should be reserved for the first row?" For a second, I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know. Because I was looking at the first row, and every seat that should have belonged to my husband and me had already been claimed by people who had spent years reminding me that I didn't really belong anywhere. My mother sat with her purse folded neatly across her lap, whispering something to my older sister without looking in my direction. My younger brother was checking his phone beneath the memorial program, convinced no one could tell. My aunt leaned toward a cousin, pointing subtly at me before both of them looked away the moment our eyes almost met. There wasn't a single empty chair. Not one. "I can sit anywhere," I heard myself say. The funeral director frowned. "Ma'ams, you are the widow." "I know." His eyes softened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded once. "I'll find you a comfortable place." He walked away before I could thank him. I stood there holding the folded speech I had written the night before. 3 pages. 14 revisions. Not because I wanted everyone to know what a wonderful husband Daniel had been. They already knew. I wanted them to understand that a good man had loved a woman they had spent most of their lives dismissing. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now let me tell you how I ended up standing at my own husband's funeral without a seat beside the people who were supposed to be my family. My name is Elena Carter. I'm 46 years old. For 22 of those years, I was married to the same man. For almost all 46, my family believed I was the least successful person among us. The strange part is that they weren't trying to be cruel. Not most of the time. They genuinely believed they were being realistic. My father used to have a saying that he repeated so often, I can still hear the rhythm of it. The world only notices people who make themselves impossible to ignore. He believed achievement should be loud. Big promotions, luxury cars, awards hanging on office walls, photographs in newspapers. He admired visible success because he had grown up with almost nothing. My grandfather worked construction until arthritis bent both of his hands. My grandmother cleaned hotel rooms for nearly 30 years. My father escaped that life by earning an engineering degree while working evening shifts at a warehouse. He respected sacrifice. But over time, he stopped respecting quiet lives. Everything became measurable. Salary, house size, job title, vacation destinations. If something couldn't be listed on paper, he wasn't sure it counted. My mother wasn't ambitious in the same way. She valued appearances. Not expensive appearances. Perfect appearances. Matching holiday sweaters. Clean windows. Well-mannered children. Neighbors who admired our family from across the street. She wasn't shallow. She was anxious. She believed that if people thought highly of us, life would somehow remain stable. So every family gathering became a performance. Smile correctly. Answer correctly. Never disagree at the table. Never admit financial struggles. Never mention illness unless it had already been solved. Everything looked polished. Nothing was allowed to look human. Then there was my sister, Victoria. 2 years older. Confident before confidence became fashionable. She entered every room expecting to be heard. Eventually everyone listened because she behaved as though they already should. She became a corporate attorney by 32. Partner by 39. She billed over 2,100 hours one year and spoke about it the way marathon runners talk about finishing Boston. I admired her. I also exhausted myself trying to earn the same admiration from her. My younger brother Ryan took a different path. Technology, startups, risk, failure, another startup, another failure. Finally, one succeeded. By 40, he'd sold part of his software company for just over $8 million. The family talked about that sale for years. Every Thanksgiving someone mentioned it. Usually him. Sometimes Dad. Often both. Then there was me. I became a librarian. Not because I couldn't do something else. Because I loved helping people find answers they didn't know they needed. I loved watching children discover the book that made them readers. I loved helping retired veterans research family history. I loved organizing chaos into something useful. My annual salary never impressed anyone. Neither did my car. Or my modest 3-bedroom home. Or the fact that I packed my lunch almost every day for 19 years. What nobody counted was that I never carried credit card debt. Daniel and I paid our mortgage 13 years early. We quietly invested every month, whether the market was up or down. By the time we reached our mid-40s, we'd built a comfortable life. Not flashy. Secure. Daniel always said security was a kind of wealth people didn't appreciate until they lost it. He worked as a civil engineer. Not the kind who appeared on television. The kind who spent months making sure bridges didn't fail. He once joked that if he did his job perfectly, nobody would ever know his name. That made him happy. He believed invisible work often mattered the most. Maybe that's why we understood each other so well. Neither of us needed applause. Just purpose. When we married, we made one simple agreement. No competing. Not with each other. Not with anyone else. Every January we'd sit at our kitchen table with coffee and legal pads. We'd write 5 goals. Sometimes they were financial. Sometimes health. Sometimes simply calling old friends more often. One year our biggest goal was planting 24 maple trees around community parks through a volunteer program. Another year it was reading 50 books together. Ordinary goals. Extraordinary consistency. 22 years later, we'd accomplished nearly every one. Quietly. My family never noticed because none of it came with headlines. Looking back, I think everything began much earlier. When I was 9, our elementary school held a small awards ceremony. Victoria won first place in mathematics. Ryan received recognition for a science competition. I earned something called the Community Kindness Award. It wasn't academic. It wasn't athletic. It recognized students who helped classmates without being asked. My teacher had nominated me because I'd spent months reading with another girl who struggled after transferring schools. I remember holding the blue ribbon all the way home. I was proud. At dinner Dad smiled politely. That's nice. Then he turned toward Victoria. So tell me more about the regional math finals. Nobody meant to erase my moment. They simply considered hers more important. That memory stayed with me. Not because of what happened. Because of what it taught me. Some accomplishments produce applause. Others produce silence. Silence doesn't necessarily mean they matter less. It only means fewer people know how to measure them. Daniel understood that story after I told him during our second date. He reached across the restaurant table. I would have framed that ribbon. I laughed. You've never even seen it. I don't have to. I actually kept it. I know. You know. You seem like someone who keeps evidence that kindness existed. He was right. The ribbon still sits inside an old cedar box. Or at least it did before he died. The call came on a rainy Tuesday. 4:17 in the afternoon. I remember because the library clock had just chimed. The emergency room physician spoke carefully. There had been an accident. A truck crossed the median. Daniel's vehicle absorbed the impact. They had done everything they could. Those words never sound real. People repeat them in movies. Then one day they belong to you. The next several days blurred together into signatures. Phone calls, flowers, paperwork, casseroles, insurance forms, and long stretches where I stared at walls without remembering what I was thinking. My family arrived quickly. To help. At least that was the intention. Everyone handled grief according to their own personality. Dad focused on logistics. He made spreadsheets, called vendors, compared funeral packages. Mom worried about guests. How many chairs? Which flowers looked appropriate? What everyone should wear? Victoria took over conversations with attorneys before anyone asked her to. Ryan offered to manage online announcements. They were all contributing. Yet somehow, through all that activity, no one asked me a simple question. What do you need? Instead, they asked things like, have you signed this? Did you call them? What are you planning? Are you sure? Questions about tasks. Never about me. I don't think they realized the difference. One evening, 3 nights before the funeral, we gathered around my dining table. Daniel's coffee mug still sat beside the sink. Nobody moved it. Mom unfolded a guest list. We're at about 187 attendees. Victoria nodded. Probably over 200 with co-workers. Dad looked at me. You'll need to keep your remarks brief. I blinked. My remarks. The eulogy. I've already written it. How long? About 12 minutes. He frowned immediately. That's too long. Before I could answer, Victoria smiled sympathetically. Dad's right, people lose focus after 5. I looked down at the pages I'd spent hours writing. They weren't dramatic. They were memories. Daniel teaching our neighbor's son how to repair a bicycle. Daniel bringing soup to a retired teacher every winter. Daniel dancing terribly in our kitchen because he knew it made me laugh. 5 minutes wouldn't even cover the first year of our marriage. I'd like to keep it the way it is, I said quietly. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then Ryan shrugged. I mean, most people are really there to pay respects, not listen to a life story. Nobody intended cruelty. That somehow made it hurt even more. Because casual dismissals leave deeper marks than angry words. Anger announces itself. Dismissal whispers. And whispers have a way of echoing for years. The conversation moved on without me. Mom circled names on the guest list, deciding which cousins should sit together. Dad compared the timing of the procession with the cemetery schedule. Victoria answered a work email she insisted couldn't wait. Ryan started calculating how many memorial programs needed to be printed in case attendance exceeded 200. I sat there listening to people organize the final day of my husband's life, while the tea in my mug slowly turned cold. No one noticed I hadn't taken a single sip. Daniel would have. He always noticed the small things. If I pushed vegetables around my plate instead of eating them, he'd quietly ask if my stomach hurt. If I folded laundry more slowly than usual, he'd ask what I was thinking about instead of why I was taking so long. He believed behavior told stories long before words did. That was one of the reasons strangers trusted him so quickly. He listened with his eyes as much as his ears. 3 months before the accident, we'd gone to a hardware store on a Saturday morning. We were buying paint for our front porch. The cashier was probably 19. Young enough that she still apologized every time the register froze. An older man behind us sighed dramatically. This is why nobody wants to work anymore. The girl immediately started apologizing. Daniel smiled. You know, he said to her, I used to think these machines only broke for me. It's comforting to know they're equally unfair to everyone. She laughed. The tension disappeared. By the time we walked outside, I asked him why he'd bothered. He looked surprised by the question. Because she'll remember today. The rude customer. No. He placed the paint cans into the trunk. I hope she'll remember someone who made her job easier instead. That was Daniel. He never tried to win arguments. He tried to reduce the amount of unnecessary pain in a room. People often mistake those two goals for being the same. They're not. Over the next 2 days, visitors came to the house almost constantly. Neighbors brought meals labeled with reheating instructions. Former co-workers arrived carrying stories I had never heard before. A retired bridge inspector drove nearly 3 hours just to spend 15 minutes telling me that Daniel had once stayed overnight at a worksite during a snowstorm because he refused to leave until every employee had made it home safely. I figured someone should tell you, the man said as he adjusted his cap. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't. The man smiled. He never mentioned most of the good things he did. After he left, I cried harder than I had since the hospital. Not because of the story. Because it sounded exactly like Daniel. There is a strange comfort in discovering that the person you loved was the same person when you weren't watching. That evening, my mother walked into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I need something to do." She nodded. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You've always been the strongest one." I turned toward her. "I don't think you've ever said that before." She looked embarrassed. "I probably haven't." "Why not?" She dried her hands with a towel before answering. "Because you never looked like you needed encouragement." That sentence explained more about my childhood than an entire year of therapy probably could have. My family hadn't ignored me because they believed I was incapable. They ignored me because they believed I was fine. Victoria demanded attention. Ryan attracted attention. Dad naturally occupied attention. Mom managed attention. I adapted. Eventually, adaptation became invisibility. It wasn't fair. But it was understandable. Understanding doesn't erase hurt. It simply changes its shape. The night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep. At 2:15 in the morning, I found myself sitting in Daniel's study. His reading glasses rested exactly where he'd left them. A yellow legal pad sat beside his desk. Half of the first page contained calculations for a volunteer bridge restoration project he had been helping review. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right. Precise. Steady. There was something oddly comforting about seeing unfinished work. It reminded me that nobody wakes up expecting their life to end before dinner. I opened the top drawer looking for blank paper. Instead, I found a plain white envelope. My name was written across the front. Not Elena. Not my wife. Just Ellie. Only Daniel called me that. My heart started pounding. I hesitated for almost a full minute before opening it. Inside was a single folded page. It wasn't dated. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, the first sentence made me laugh through my tears. "Before you panic, this isn't one of those mysterious letters people write because they think they're dying." That sounded exactly like him. I simply realized last week that I've spent 22 years telling other people how much you matter and assuming you already knew. I stopped reading. Not because I wanted to. Because I couldn't see through the tears. After several minutes, I continued. "So I'm writing this down while I remember. You have spent most of your life surrounded by people who admire loud accomplishments. They're good people. They simply don't recognize quiet strength as quickly. Please don't resent them for that. They're measuring with the only ruler they've ever known. But I've had the privilege of living beside you. I've watched what happens when nobody is keeping score. I've watched neighbors trust you with spare keys. I've watched frightened children smile because you remembered their favorite books. I've watched friends call you before they called their own families. I've watched our finances become secure because you never confused appearances with value. I've watched you forgive people who never realized they were asking forgiveness. I've watched you become the safest place I've ever known. Then came one sentence. One simple sentence. If anyone ever makes you feel small after I'm gone, remember this. I built bridges for a living. You built the people who walked across them. I pressed the paper against my chest. For years people had praised Daniel's intelligence, his engineering, his discipline. Yet the greatest thing he'd ever built was my understanding of myself. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside my purse. I didn't know then that it wouldn't be the last letter connected to Daniel. The next morning arrived with grey skies and light rain. The kind that never becomes a storm but never fully stops either. By 8:30, the funeral home parking lot was already filling. Black umbrellas moved slowly between rows of cars. People hugged quietly. Voices stayed low. Grief has its own volume. Inside, the visitation room smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Daniel's photograph stood beside the guest book. It had been taken during a hiking trip 5 years earlier. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was laughing at something I'd said just before the picture was taken. Everyone commented on that photograph. It looks so natural. It captures him perfectly. It feels like he's still here. I agreed. Because Daniel had always smiled with his entire face. Not just his mouth. As people arrived, I noticed something unexpected. Many of them weren't introducing themselves by their professions. They introduced themselves by moments. I'm the father whose son Daniel tutored in math. I'm the nurse from the blood drive. I'm the volunteer from Habitat for Humanity. I'm the woman whose car he stopped to help during a snowstorm. One after another. Stories. Not resumes. Not titles. Lives. I realized I'd only known a fraction of the ways my husband had quietly entered other people's worlds. Then I noticed something else. My family seemed surprised. Dad had expected co-workers. There were far more neighbors than executives. More teachers than engineers. More ordinary people than influential ones. The line stretched through the lobby. One funeral attendant quietly brought out another guest register because the first one had filled. Ryan leaned toward Victoria. I didn't know he knew this many people. Victoria answered softly. I don't think we knew him as well as we thought. For the first time all week, neither of them sounded certain about anything. And that uncertainty was only the beginning. The visitation lasted almost an hour longer than anyone had planned. Not because people lingered over the flowers. Because they lingered over the stories. A woman in her 70s stood in front of Daniel's photograph for nearly 5 minutes before walking toward me. She wore a navy coat despite the warm weather, and she carried herself with the careful movements of someone whose knees reminded her of every year she'd lived. I'm sorry, she said, you don't know me. I shook my head. I don't believe we've met. My name is Margaret Ellison. She smiled through tired eyes. Your husband changed the last 12 years of my life. I waited. I lost my husband in 2014. She glanced toward Daniel's picture. I had no idea how to manage the paperwork, taxes, insurance, the house, all of it. She laughed quietly. I cried in the county office because I couldn't understand one of the forms. What happened? A man sitting 3 chairs away asked if he could look at it. She looked directly at me. It was Daniel. I blinked. He stayed with me for nearly 3 hours. I stared at her. He called the insurance company. He explained every document. He drove behind me all the way home because I hadn't driven that far since my husband died. I opened my mouth to speak. Nothing came out. He checked on me every Christmas after that. She reached into her purse and removed a Christmas card. It was worn around the edges from years of being opened. He never signed it with his full name. She smiled. It always just said, your friend Daniel. She touched my hand. I wanted you to know that your husband gave me back my confidence. Before I could answer, another person stepped beside her. Then another. The stories never seemed to end. A high school principal explained how Daniel had quietly paid for winter coats through a school program, without allowing anyone to know the donor's name. A mechanic remembered Daniel spending 4 consecutive Saturdays helping renovate a youth center after discovering the project had lost volunteers. A young father described how Daniel had stayed in the hospital waiting room with him all night, while his daughter underwent emergency surgery because the man's relatives lived 6 states away. He barely knew me, the father said. But he said nobody should sit alone in a hospital. Every story sounded different. Yet they all contained the same pattern. Daniel noticed people standing alone. Then he quietly walked toward them. No speeches, no announcements. Just presence. As I listened, I became aware of something unusual. My father had stopped organizing. He wasn't checking schedules anymore. He wasn't adjusting seating charts. He simply stood a few feet away, listening. His expression had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for someone who had known him for 46 years to recognize it. Confusion. Not about the stories. About the man he'd thought he understood. Dad respected Daniel. But he'd always categorized him. Reliable. Intelligent. Responsible. A solid engineer. Now he was hearing about someone who had built an invisible network of kindness that stretched across an entire community. There was no spreadsheet for that. No promotion. No title. No annual performance review. Only people. Hundreds of them. Eventually, the funeral director approached. It will be time to begin in 10 minutes. The room slowly quieted. People found their seats. Or at least they found the seats they believed belonged to them. I stood near the entrance watching everyone settle in. Exactly as before, the first row had filled without anyone asking where I intended to sit. Mom occupied the aisles. Dad beside her. Victoria. Ryan. My Aunt Helen's. 2 cousins. 7 seats. 7 family members. No space remained. The funeral director caught my eye again. He looked almost apologetic. I've reserved a chair for you. He pointed toward the 2nd row. Beside 2 of Daniel's former co-workers. I smiled. Thank you. As I walked toward the chair, one of those co-workers immediately stood. No, he shook his head. You're sitting here. He gestured toward the aisle seat. My wife and I can move over. I protested. You don't have to. We know. His wife smiled warmly. We want to. It was such a small gesture. 1 seat. 1 movement. Yet it somehow carried more consideration than anything I'd experienced all week. The service began. Soft piano music floated through the chapel. People stood. Sat. Prayed. The minister spoke about grief not as an event, but as a language people slowly learn after losing someone they love. He spoke well. Simply. Without trying to solve pain. Then he invited me forward. I unfolded the pages I'd rewritten 14 times. My hands trembled. Not because I feared public speaking. Because every sentence represented a life that had ended too soon. I looked at Daniel's photograph. Then at the people filling nearly every chair. I've been trying to decide, I began, how to summarize 22 years with one person. A few quiet smiles appeared. I finally realized that's impossible. So instead, I'd like to tell you about one Tuesday evening. I told them about burnt spaghetti. About the smoke alarm that refused to stop beeping. About Daniel insisting that every great marriage should include at least one completely failed dinner every year, because perfection made for boring memories. People laughed. Softly. Exactly where Daniel would have wanted them to. Then I spoke about his patience. His consistency. His habit of carrying jumper cables because, as he often said, someone always needs them when you leave them at home. Every few minutes I glanced down at my notes. But eventually I stopped reading altogether. The memories knew where they wanted to go. When I finished, the room remained silent for several seconds. Not awkward silence. The kind that follows truth. Then people quietly wiped their eyes. I returned to my seat. My father didn't say anything. Neither did Victoria. Yet I noticed both of them looking at me differently. As though they'd just realized I had known parts of Daniel none of them ever would. The minister stepped back to the podium. We'll conclude with a brief reading. He opened his folder. Before he could begin, however, the rear doors of the chapel opened. Every head turned. A man in a charcoal suit entered, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He wasn't rushing, but he walked with unmistakable purpose. He quietly approached the funeral director and spoke for perhaps 20 seconds. The director's eyebrows lifted. Then he looked toward me. The man followed his gaze. When our eyes met, he gave a polite nod. He walked directly down the center aisle. Past my parents. Past my sister. Past everyone else. Until he stopped beside my chair. Mrs. Carter. Yes, my name is Jonathan Pierce. He extended his hand. I'm your husband's attorney. The room became very still. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. I know. He looked genuinely regretful. I arrived as quickly as I could. I flew in from Chicago this morning. And I stared at him. Is something wrong? No. He lowered his voice. Something is unfinished. Behind us, I could feel more than 200 people watching. Mr. Pierce glanced toward the minister. I'm very sorry for the interruption. But Daniel left explicit written instructions. He asked that, if circumstances unfolded as he believed they might. He paused carefully. One final letter should be read before today's service concluded. A quiet murmur spread through the chapel. I looked at him in disbelief. My husband wrote another letter. Yes. He rested a hand on the briefcase. And according to his instructions. He looked around the room. Every single person here was meant to hear it. Mr. Pierce waited until the whispering settled. He wasn't theatrical. In fact, if anything, he looked uncomfortable being the center of attention. Years later, I would learn that he specialized in estate planning. His work usually happened inside quiet conference rooms with 3 people present, not funeral chapels filled with more than 200 mourners. He opened the leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. Inside was a cream-colored envelope. The paper looked familiar. Daniel always bought the same stationery every January. He claimed that good paper made people slow down enough to think before they wrote. My heart began beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Mr. Pierce looked toward me. Mrs. Carter, before I read this, I need to explain one thing. I nodded. Your husband revised his estate documents about 14 months ago. 14 months. I tried to remember what had happened then. Then it came back. That had been the year Daniel underwent what should have been routine heart testing, after a company medical screening found a minor irregularity. The results were completely normal. But for 3 anxious weeks, neither of us knew that. Daniel had laughed afterward. If that scare taught me anything, he'd said, it's that responsible people don't postpone conversations simply because they're uncomfortable. Apparently, he hadn't been talking only about medical paperwork. Mr. Pierce continued. He instructed me that this letter was only to be read if, at the time of his funeral, your wife appeared to be standing alone. The room seemed to inhale all at once. I didn't move. Neither did anyone else. He chose those words carefully. Standing alone. Not physically. Emotionally. Mr. Pierce unfolded the pages. There are 3. He adjusted his glasses. Then he began. If Jonathan is reading this, then something happened exactly the way I hoped it wouldn't. First, Ellie. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you're hearing my words instead of my voice. If love alone could keep people alive, I imagine I'd still be sitting beside you complaining that the coffee at my own funeral reception needs more sugar. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the chapel. Even through tears. That was Daniel. Finding room for warmth where everyone else only saw sorrow. Mr. Pierce continued. Second, I'd like to speak to everyone else. He looked up briefly. No one shifted. No one coughed. No one reached for a phone. Every eye remained fixed on him. If you're here today, thank you. Whether we met once or 1,000 times, thank you for giving part of your life to mine. Now I'd like to ask one favor. Please don't spend today trying to remember what I accomplished. Remember how you felt after spending time with me. Another pause. Then, there's a difference. I watched people lower their heads. Some smiled. Some cried. A former co-worker quietly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Mr. Pierce turned the page. His expression grew more serious. Finally, I'd like to speak to my family. He looked toward the front row. Not dramatically. Simply because that was where my family happened to be sitting. And yes, I mean all of yous. Dad slowly straightened in his seat. Victoria folded her hands together. Ryan looked down. Mom's eyes never left the paper. During the 22 years I spent married to Ellie, I noticed something that took me far too long to understand. None of you disliked her. In fact, most of you loved her. Several confused expressions appeared, including mine. But love isn't always the same thing as seeing. The sentence settled over the room like gentle rain. People tend to notice whoever asks for help the loudest. Whoever celebrates the biggest victories. Whoever creates the greatest emergencies. Ellie rarely did any of those things. So she became easy to overlook. No accusation. No anger. Just observation. That somehow made every word land harder. Over 2 decades, I watched holiday dinners where someone interrupted her halfway through a story. I remembered. Christmas. 7 years earlier. I'd been talking about a literacy program. Ryan had answered a phone call. Everyone had started discussing his company. Nobody ever came back to my story. I'd forgotten it. Daniel hadn't. Mr. Pierce continued reading. I watched birthdays where everyone thanked her for organizing everything without asking whether she'd enjoyed the day herself. Mom closed her eyes. I knew exactly which birthday he meant. She knew too. I watched family vacations where Ellie quietly packed everyone's lunches while conversations about success happened in the next room. My sister's shoulders lowered. Barely, but enough. None of these moments seemed important. That's precisely why they mattered. Silence. Complete silence. Character is rarely revealed by extraordinary days. It's revealed by ordinary Tuesdays. I smiled despite myself. Daniel always loved Tuesdays. No expectations, he'd say. If someone chooses kindness on a Tuesday, they probably mean it. Mr. Pierce reached the final page. His own voice had grown quieter. Perhaps because he'd read these words before. Perhaps because they affected him too. If my family is hearing this, I'd like to ask something difficult. Don't defend yourselves. Nobody moved. Your first instinct will be to remember every generous thing you've done for Ellie. I'm sure there are many. Keep remembering them. But after that, ask yourselves a different question. Another pause. When was the last time you became curious about her life, instead of assuming you already understood it? I heard someone crying softly behind me. Not sobbing. Just quiet tears. When was the last time you asked her opinion before offering your own? When was the last time you celebrated one of her achievements with the same enthusiasm you reserved for promotions, salaries, or awards? No one looked toward my family anymore. They looked inward. Toward themselves. Because I think everyone suddenly remembered someone in their own life who quietly carried more than anyone noticed. Mr. Pierce took a slow breath. Then he read the final section. Ellie has spent 22 years making our house feel like the safest place I've ever known. If you want to honor my memory, don't build a monument. Become a safer place for her. His voice stopped. The last page remained in his hands. No one applauded. No one spoke. The room simply sat inside those words. After nearly a full minute, Mr. Pierce folded the letter carefully. I have one final responsibility. He looked directly at me. Daniel asked me to tell you something that isn't written here. I stood slowly. What is it? Mr. Pierce smiled. The day he signed this letter, he stayed behind after our meeting. He said. The attorney's smile widened with unmistakable affection. Jonathan, if you ever have to read that letter, my wife is going to apologize to you for causing extra work. A few gentle laughs echoed through the chapel. Mr. Pierce looked at me. And he was right. I realized what I had been about to say. I'm sorry you had to. He chuckled softly. He knew. Then his expression became serious again. He also told me something else. He said, she's spent her whole life believing she's ordinary. Please make sure she knows I disagreed. That was it. Nothing more. No shocking inheritance. No dramatic revelation. No secret fortune. Just a husband who understood his wife so completely that he anticipated the loneliness she might feel after he was gone, and left words strong enough to meet her there. In that moment, I realized the letter hadn't changed who anyone was. It had simply held up a mirror that no one in the room had expected to face. No one stood immediately. The minister quietly closed his Bible. The pianist rested her hands in her lap. Even the funeral director, who had spent decades keeping services on schedule, seemed to understand that time had become irrelevant for a few minutes. People weren't waiting for instructions. They were thinking. The first person to move wasn't my father. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't even one of my siblings. It was Margaret Ellison, the widow who had met Daniel in a government office 12 years earlier. She walked slowly toward me until she was standing only a few feet away. I hope you don't mind, she said softly. I shook my head. She embraced me without another word. It wasn't the kind of hug people give because they don't know what else to do. It was steady, quiet, certain. When she stepped back, she smiled through tears. He was right. I looked at her. You are a very safe place. Then she returned to her seat. One after another, people approached. Not all of them hugged me. Some simply squeezed my hand. Some nodded. One elderly man placed a folded handkerchief into my palm because he noticed mine was soaked through. A young woman introduced herself as a former volunteer from the library. You probably don't remember me. I searched her face. She smiled. I was 15. I wanted to quit school. Recognition came slowly. Emily. Her eyes widened. You remember. You loved astronomy. You checked out every space book we had. She laughed through tears. You remembered that. Of course. She looked down for a moment. You convinced me to apply for college. I became an aerospace engineer. My mouth opened slightly. I didn't convince you. You already wanted it. She smiled. No, you believed I wanted it before I did. She touched my arm. I wouldn't have been in the room today if you hadn't. Then she walked away. Another story. Another life. Another piece of evidence I never knew existed. It occurred to me that perhaps this was what Daniel had been trying to tell me all along. Most of the important things we do never arrive with applause. They arrive years later. Quietly. In someone else's memory. Eventually, people began making their way toward the reception hall. The chapel emptied slowly. My family remained seated. Almost as if none of them knew what to say first. Dad was the one who finally stood. He didn't walk toward me immediately. Instead, he looked at Daniel's photograph for a long time. Then he came over. For the first time in my adult life, my father seemed unsure of himself. He stopped an arm's length away. Elena. He almost never used my full name. Usually it was Ellie because Daniel said it, or simply Honey. Today it was Elena. Formal. Respectful. As though he understood he needed to begin again. I've been thinking. I waited. When Jonathan read that letter. He paused. My first reaction was to defend myself. A sad smile crossed his face. I started listing all the reasons he was wrong. He looked down briefly. Then I realized. I was doing exactly what he asked me not to do. Neither of us spoke. I don't think I saw it. His voice cracked. Not because you weren't there. Because I convinced myself that needing less attention meant needing less love. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. It didn't erase 40 years. Nothing could. But it acknowledged them. And acknowledgement is often where healing begins. I'm sorry. Those two words sounded different from the countless automatic apologies people offer every day. There was no explanation attached. No if. No but. Just, I'm sorry. I nodded once. I know. He frowned slightly. You know. I know you're sorry. For a long moment we simply looked at each other. Then he did something he hadn't done since I was probably 12 years old. He kissed my forehead. When he stepped away, neither of us was crying anymore. Not because we weren't sad. Because something had quietly shifted. Mom approached next. She held my hands exactly the way she used to when I came home sick from elementary school. I've replayed every birthday he mentioned. She laughed sadly. I remember every single one. So do I. I kept telling myself you were independent. She squeezed my fingers. It became an excuse. I know. She nodded. I think that's the hardest part. What is? Realizing I wasn't cruel. I was comfortable. There was wisdom in that observation. Cruelty is easier to reject. Comfort can blind good people for decades. Victoria waited until Mom stepped aside. She crossed her arms. Uncrossed them. Then sighed. I hated that letter. I raised an eyebrow. She gave a tiny laugh. I know. I hated it because halfway through I realized I wasn't angry at Daniel. I was embarrassed. She looked toward the now empty first row. I've spent my whole career believing that careful observation is my greatest strength. She smiled without humor. And somehow I missed my own sister. I reached for her hand. She looked surprised. You don't have to make this easier for me. I'm not. I'm holding your hand because I want to. For the first time in years, she let someone comfort her without resisting. Ryan came last. That wasn't unusual. Even as a child, he'd always waited until everyone else had spoken. He shoved both hands into his pockets. I've been trying to remember the last real conversation we had. I smiled gently. The barbecue. He shook his head. No, I mean one where I asked about your life. Neither of us could remember. That answer hurt both of us. I talk too much. He laughed awkwardly. You've noticed. I've noticed you get excited. He nodded. I always thought excitement was generosity. He looked down. I think sometimes it's just taking up all the air in the room. I had never heard my younger brother speak that honestly. Not once. I'm sorry, Ed.